Jade Carson balanced the household ledger on her forearm and carried her own coal scuttle down the narrow back stair that had once been reserved for maids, the iron handle biting into her palm through a thin glove, while voices drifted from the breakfast parlour she no longer entered. Her old world remained 30 paces away, separated by a corridor, a door, and a rule she had written for herself with shaking hands 6 weeks earlier. She would not let Carson House be sold in pieces to satisfy her father's debts, and she would not permit the servants who had buried him to be cast into the street for his failures. She had left the silk rooms on the east side without witnesses, carried one trunk to the former steward's quarters at the Mews, and signed the household books as Miss Carson, domestic daughter, a title no one had used before and everyone understood at once. The steward's quarters had low ceilings, a warped window, and a grate that smoked in damp weather. The wallpaper peeled near the washstand where steam gathered each morning. Her bed was narrow enough that turning required intention. None of it offended her. The offence lived elsewhere, in the arrangement itself, in the way she now waited outside doors in the house where she had been born, and in the new etiquette that required footmen who had taught her to whistle for the stable hounds to lower their gaze and call her Miss, as if they had never known her at all. She set down the scuttle, wiped coal dust from the ledger's edge with the corner of her apron, and crossed the yard to the service corridor before the first bell. Mrs. Lenora Carson preferred account books reviewed before tea, not because urgency demanded it, but because discomfort did. Jade understood the method. Lenora did not shout. She assigned, she corrected. She spoke as though every life in the house were a column to be narrowed. By the second week of September, Jade had learned the pace of that voice better than she had ever known the clocks. Lenora sat at the writing table in the morning room with a shawl of dark green silk folded so precisely over her shoulders that the fringe did not move when she reached for the page. She had not yet removed her gloves. Sun struck the rings on her right hand and left the rest of her expression in shadow. When Jade entered, she did not look up immediately. She finished her line, sanded the ink, then lifted her eyes as if acknowledging a tradesman. "You are late by 3 minutes." "The butcher changed the tally when he saw the kitchen order," Jade said. "I corrected it before presenting the account." Lenora held out her hand. Jade crossed the room and placed the ledger there. She remained standing. The pages turned. Lenora's finger paused on a notation for lamp oil, moved to flour, then to the line marked broth bones, her mouth flattened by a degree. "You continue to feed people who are not your concern. The bones are for the scullery girl. She has not kept meat down since Tuesday. She has wages. She sends half to her mother in Stepney." Lenora closed the ledger with a soft thud and rested both gloved hands upon it, as though sealing a box. "This household will not become a charity because you enjoy gestures." Jade kept her voice level. "The expense is mine. Everything in this house is mine now." The sentence settled between them with the finality of legal language. It was not entirely true, and both women knew the boundaries were under review by solicitors, yet Lenora used certainty the way other people used locks. Jade felt her fingers stiffen around the strap of her account satchel and made herself unclench them, one by one, inside the fabric. Lenora rose and crossed to the mantel where a stack of correspondence lay beneath a paperweight, shaped like a ship. She selected one folded sheet, turned back, and handed it to Jade, without offering a chair. "Mr. Alfred Bellamy," Lenora said, "widower, owner of 3 wool mills in Surrey and 2 houses in Bath. He has 1 daughter in school and no son." Jade did not open the letter. She recognized the heavy cream stock of a solicitor's office and the faint scent of lavender paste used in Lenora's private stationery press. "Why am I reading this?" "You are not reading it. You are accepting it." Silence stretched. In the corridor outside, a maid's pail scraped stone. A carriage rolled past the front gates, bright and distant. Jade stood in her plain day dress with mended cuffs, while the woman who had married her father after her mother's death explained her own future as if discussing linen inventory. "The contract will be drafted this fortnight," Lenora continued. "You will sign at month's end. Affection is irrelevant. Obedience is cheaper." Jade placed the folded letter on the corner of the writing table with exact care. She did not ask whether she had a choice. Lenora preferred refusals she could lecture away. Questions offered her too much room. "I keep this house solvent," Jade said. "I have reduced food waste by a third, renegotiated grain, and stopped 2 false invoices from the fishmonger. Mr. Bellamy does not require a wife. He requires an efficient clerk." Lenora's expression did not alter. "Then you are well suited. You have practice." A tiny tremor ran through Jade's right hand. She tucked both hands behind her back before it could be seen. "My father did not raise me for sale." "Your father," Lenora said, "left debts that would have sold us all if I had not acted when you were still choosing mourning ribbons. Do not invoke him in arguments you cannot afford." The words struck cleanly because they were sharpened by partial truth. Her father had gambled on expansion, then on recovery, then on one final season that never came. Jade had found the unpaid drafts herself after the funeral. Numbers slashed through and rewritten, promises stacked under paperweights like dead leaves. Lenora had indeed moved quickly. She had renegotiated loans, dismissed suppliers, liquidated decorative silver, and tightened every room in Carson House until warmth became a liability. She had also seized every authority she could reach and treated kindness as a leak to be patched. Jade inclined her head once. It was not agreement. It was the nearest safe thing. "If there is no further instruction, Mrs. Carson, the market cart leaves at 8. "There is one instruction." Jade waited. Lenora's gaze lingered on her face, then slid to the apron tied over her skirt, the practical shoes, the ink smudge near her cuff. "You are useful when silent." Jade dipped into the smallest curtsy protocol allowed, turned, and walked out without haste. The corridor felt cooler than the room she had left. She did not cry. She moved through the servants' passage to the yard, checked the produce list against yesterday's remaining stores, and recalculated 3 meals in her head while scraping mud from the cartwheel with a broken spoon. That was how she survived now, by making each hour require her hands. The market punished hesitation. Carts crowded the lane behind St. James's before dawn had fully lifted, porters shouting for space while fishmongers banged scales into place and poulterers argued over weight with theatrical outrage. Jade worked quickly, paying in counted coins from the housekeeping purse and from her own smaller purse when Lenora's allotment ran short. She bought turnips with bruised shoulders because they could be trimmed into soup, onions by the sack, and stale loaves from a baker who looked away when she asked for a lower figure the 3rd week running. She made a private stop at the apothecary for willowbark powder and added it to her satchel between soap and twine. When she returned, the front steps glowed in polished stone and brass, while the service entrance smelled of yeast, wet wool, and potatoes. 2 footmen in house livery unloaded crates without meeting her eyes. One had once carried her books to the schoolroom and shown her how to tie a hunting knot. He now took instructions from the under-housekeeper in a voice stripped of memory. "Set the citrus aside," Jade said, consulting her tally. "Flour to pantry, roots to lower cool room, bones to scullery." "As you direct, miss," the under-housekeeper replied, neutral and careful, as if every word might be reported upstairs. Jade spent the afternoon in the still room balancing invoices and copying figures into the household book until the numbers blurred into one another. At dusk she carried fresh bread and broth to the scullery girl, waited while she swallowed 3 spoonfuls, then returned to her quarters to mend torn sacking under lamplight. Her needle flashed, disappeared, flashed again. The house above her shifted and settled around midnight, beams creaking like old ships. Saturday came with the ring of delivery wheels on stone, a sound she had begun to dread because it required a ritual of subtraction. Every week she stood at the service entrance with clipped market slips in hand, accepted discounted provisions for a household that had once opened its front doors for her, and signed for goods as if she were someone temporarily employed in her own name. She stepped into the yard as the morning cart drew up. The man who jumped down wore workman's gloves, plain coat, and cap pulled low against the pale sun. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had carried weight all his life, yet when he straightened, there was a stillness in him that did not belong to hurried trade. "Miss Carson," he said, before she had introduced herself. His voice was measured, educated at the edges, then roughened as if by choice. His eyes were grey, not soft, not hard, attentive. She offered the list. "You have us for flour, potatoes, and cured ham. Last week's order lacked 1 sack of oats and 6 lemons." He scanned the page once. "Noted. I brought the missing lemons. No charge." She blinked. "Most suppliers dispute shortages first. Most suppliers are careless first." He turned to the cart, lifted a crate and set it down near the threshold. A second man remained seated on the bench with reins in hand, hat brim lowered. Beyond the mew's turn and unseen by Jade, a polished black carriage waited with a uniformed driver holding the horses steady. The under-housekeeper approached, frowned at the stack, and whispered sharply to a kitchen maid about theft and waste. Jade felt the familiar tightening at the back of her neck. Lenora had made accusations by suggestion all week. One missing crate would become an inquiry. An inquiry would become a deduction from staff wages. She did not wait for anyone's permission. She stepped forward, bent, and took the heaviest crate herself, the wood rough against her palms through thin gloves. The weight drove into her shoulders. She carried it across the threshold and set it on the flagged floor inside the pantry, breath controlled, expression blank. When she turned back, the delivery man was watching her with a look she could not immediately classify. Not surprise, not pity. Recognition, perhaps, and something more guarded than either. He crossed the yard in 2 strides and took the next crate before she reached it. "You should not be lifting this alone, Miss Carson," he said. The words were ordinary. The tone was not. It held the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and for one suspended moment, Jade felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with fact. She inclined her head because that was safest. "Then we shall lift quickly, Mr. Reed," he said. "Mr. Reed." She repeated it once, committing it to memory for the invoice book, and together they carried the remaining crates into the pantry, while the house, above and beyond them, kept its counsel. Together they carried the remaining crates into the pantry, while the house, above and beyond them, kept its counsel. Jade knelt on the stone flags to break twine and check each delivery against the slips. And Mr. Reed, instead of standing idle as most men in trade did once the goods were over the threshold, crouched opposite her and turned labels toward the light, so she could read them without lifting every sack. "This flour is not the grade you were sent last week," he said quietly, tapping the stencil with one gloved finger. "Finer mill, same charge. Keep the note with your records." She looked up. "You inspected each sack before loading?" "I inspect what carries my name." He said it plainly, then rose and hauled the final barrel to the back shelf with controlled strength that made no display of itself. When she signed the invoice, he waited for the ink to dry before folding the paper, as if signatures mattered and were not merely obstacles between one errand and the next. The under-housekeeper hovered at the door and cleared her throat. "Miss Carson, Mrs. Carson requests the luncheon account within the quarter hour." Jade set down the pen. "I will bring it." "Mr." Reed inclined his head to her, then to no one else. "Good day, Miss Carson." He left through the yard gate, boots quiet on stone. She did not follow. She turned to the shelves, counted potatoes twice, and entered each figure in the pantry book with small, exact numerals, so no one could claim she had been careless. By noon, she was back in the morning room, standing beside Lenora's writing table while steam thinned from untouched tea. Lenora read the luncheon figures, struck a line through the fish entry, and wrote "unnecessary" in the margin with a hand so tidy it felt punitive. "We will not serve haddock on Tuesdays," Lenora said. "Broth and bread are sufficient. You have ordered fresh parsley again." It was one bunch. The cook can stretch broth for 2 days with herbs. Lenora did not glance up. "You are useful when silent." Jade folded her hands behind her back and let the reprimand settle where the others had settled, in the same quiet place she had built to keep herself upright. The room smelled of beeswax and lavender starch. A fire snapped in the grate, though the day did not require it, because comfort in that room served rank, not weather. When Lenora dismissed her with the smallest lift of her pen, Jade crossed the corridor to the servants' hall and posted the revised meal list on the wall, then returned to the still room to cut costs by candlelight and arithmetic. She thinned sauces with stock instead of cream. She sold stale biscuit crumbs to a confectioner's apprentice who used them in cheap puddings. She unpicked old velvet draperies from a disused bedchamber and had the lining turned into winter petticoats for kitchen maids who had no money for wool. No one asked her to do any of this. That was precisely why it mattered. The days took shape by sound. The rattle of coal scuttles before dawn, the ring of knives being sharpened in the lower kitchen, the front bell that announced callers she would not meet, the rustle of letters she now carried, but did not open. Her world had narrowed into back passages and account books, yet each corridor still held memory like a draft under a closed door. The stair where she had once raced a cousin in house slippers was now the stair where she waited for maids to pass with ash buckets. The long gallery where her father had taught her to read shipping marks on framed maps was now locked, except on formal evenings, because formal evenings still pretended the family remained intact. 4 days passed before Lenora called her into the study with the family solicitor present, and the presence itself was instruction. Mr. Hale stood by the mantel with his spectacles low on his nose and a folio tucked under one arm. He spoke to Lenora first, then turned to Jade with professional courtesy that was careful rather than kind. "Miss Carson, Mrs. Carson has requested that I draft preliminary arrangements regarding your proposed marriage settlement." Jade kept her gaze on him, not on Lenora. "Proposed by whom?" "By your household authority," Lenora answered before he could. "And by necessity." Mr. Hale opened the folio and withdrew a page. "Mr. Bellamy seeks clarity concerning dowry substitution and future claims against Carson shipping liabilities." There it was, laid clean on paper. Not companionship, not family, liability. Jade accepted the page, read the terms once, and set it back on the desk. "I will review this with my own copy." Lenora gave a soft, almost bored laugh. "You have no solicitor." "I have handwriting. I can read." Lenora's eyes lifted, cool and flat. "You may read what is handed to you. You may not negotiate." Jade inclined her head. "As you wish, Mrs. Carson." She left before silence could be interpreted as consent, crossed the service yard and scrubbed ink from her fingers at the pump until the water numbed her skin. She did not cry. She straightened, picked up the produce basket, and walked to market because supper still had to be made. By the second Saturday of that month, the household had learned her new rhythm and treated it as permanent. Footmen set down parcels just beyond her reach, so she would have to step forward and claim them. The cook, who had once sent up sugared pears to Jade's schoolroom on birthdays, now addressed her through the under-housekeeper when others were present and only spoke plainly when they were alone. A maid asked for mending thread with eyes lowered, then whispered, "Thank you," as if gratitude itself could be punished. Jade bore each small cut without performance. She wrote numbers. She carried sacks. She slept with one candle stub beside the bed and woke before first light because useful women did not require waking. Saturday again brought delivery wheels to the mews, and with them Mr. Reed. This time he came without the younger cartman. He jumped down alone, tied the horse, and took the list from her gloved hand before the under-housekeeper could step between them. "You have reduced sugar by half," he observed. "Mrs. Carson prefers restraint." "Mrs. Carson prefers appearances." The words were soft enough that only Jade heard them. She looked at him directly, surprised not by insolence, but by precision. His coat was the same plain wool as before, yet his cuffs were cleaner than most labourers' linen, and his diction remained disciplined even when he spoke in a lowered voice. His hands were calloused, truly calloused, but on his right hand there was a pale band at the base of the finger, where a ring had once sat long enough to leave its shape. What Jade did not know, what no one in the yard knew, was that around the corner a polished black carriage waited again, horses held steady by a uniformed driver who did not shift in his seat. Mr. Reed set down a crate of oranges, bright against the grey morning, and her eyes went to it at once. "These are not in season. They were available. They are costly." "They were available," he repeated. The under-housekeeper approached with narrowed eyes. "We did not order oranges," Jade answered without looking away from the crate. "We did now. Charge them to my personal account." Mr. Reed shook his head once. "No charge." "Then I cannot accept them." "You can," he said, and there was no force in his tone, only certainty. "The previous supplier overbilled you for oats in August. This settles the difference." The under-housekeeper, hearing only the practical language of correction, gave a curt nod and retreated toward the kitchen door. Jade waited until she had gone. "You keep records of overbilling by household?" she asked. "I keep records of theft," he said, "in all forms." He lifted a second crate and followed her inside. In the pantry doorway she paused to move aside a chipped ceramic jug, and he did not crowd her space, did not offer false familiarity, simply waited until she stepped clear. The restraint unsettled her more than boldness would have. As they stacked apples, a shout rose from the yard. One of the younger footmen had dropped a sack of grain, and flour dust burst over his boots. The under-housekeeper began to scold him in clipped tones, each word sharper because witnesses were present. The boy's ears reddened. He bent to gather what could be saved with frantic hands. Jade set down the tally slate and walked out at once. "Stop," she said to the under-housekeeper. The split seam caused it, not the boy. He was careless. He was carrying 2 sacks because we are short-staffed. The under-housekeeper drew herself up, glancing towards the windows as if Lenora might be watching. "If we report loss, wages will be docked. Rules are rules." Jade crouched, gathered unspoiled grain into a clean bin, and rose with flour on her sleeves. "Then reported against breakage in transit. I will sign." "You cannot authorize—" "I keep the books," Jade said, not loud, not pleading. "Use my line item." The under-housekeeper hesitated, calculating risk. Behind Jade, Mr. Reed stepped into the yard and stood still, merely present, his shoulders squared in a way that suggested he would not move for anyone's convenience. He did not speak. He did not need to. The under-housekeeper glanced at him, then back at Jade, and made her decision. "Very well, miss, against your line item." "Thank you." When the woman turned away, the young footman whispered an apology to Jade without meeting her eyes. She handed him a cloth, then returned to the pantry where Mr. Reed had already restacked 2 flour sacks that would have toppled later. "You have a talent," he said, "for paying costs no one else will even name." She checked the ink on the invoice before answering. "Someone must pay them." He held out the folded receipt. Their fingers did not touch. Not always. The words stayed with her through the afternoon as she sorted lentils and corrected 3 copied entries in the kitchen ledger. Near dusk, she carried stale crusts to the stable yard and found the groom's son mending tack with cold hands. She gave him bread and half an orange, then walked back before he could thank her in front of anyone else. On Sunday, after early service at St. James's, where she stood in the rear pew among servants and widows, she came down the church steps with her market basket and saw Mr. Reed across the square, coat collar turned up, speaking to an elderly porter with the same attentive stillness he brought to every task. He looked up, as if he had sensed her gaze. "Miss Carson." "Mr. Reed." He stepped aside so an older woman could pass between them, then took the heavier of Jade's 2 baskets without asking. "The cobbles are slick. I am walking this direction." "You are delivering on Sunday now?" "I am observing supply routes." The answer was so formal it bordered on absurd. She almost smiled, then checked herself. "That sounds very serious for potatoes." "Potatoes decide more households than Parliament," he said, and for the first time she saw it. The brief curve of a smile that altered his entire face from controlled reserve to something unexpectedly warm, almost dangerous in its clarity. She took back the basket at the corner where their paths divided. "You are not what you appear to be, Mr. Reed." He met her gaze without flinching. "Neither are you, Miss Carson." Before she could answer, a groom in unfamiliar livery hurried past them towards the West Road, and Reed's attention flicked for one instant to the man's badge, registering it with the reflex of command. Then he inclined his head and stepped away. That evening, Jade returned to the steward's quarters with mud at her hem and a folded market list in her pocket, and found a single orange set on her doorstep, unmarked, uncharged, and bright as a lamp in the dim passage. She looked down the corridor. No one stood there. Upstairs, Carson House carried on with its polished dinners and measured cruelties. But in the narrow rooms at the back, where she had taught herself to live by ledgers and restraint, a new variable had entered the arithmetic, and it had begun to refuse subtraction. Jade stood with the orange in her hand until the candle at the far end of the passage burned low and bent toward its own wax. The fruit was cool, weighty, and faintly fragrant through its skin, a small sun left on stone in a house that rationed even sweetness. She turned it once beneath the light, searching for a card, a mark, any sign of sender or account. There was none. She carried it inside, set it beside the chipped basin, and unpinned her cuffs with the same careful fingers she used for ledgers. She did not keep it for herself. She cut it into 6 narrow crescents and wrapped them in muslin. 2 went to the groom's son at dawn, 2 to the scullery girl with her broth, and 2 she left for the nightmaids in the still room with no note attached. By the time the household woke into its layered hierarchy, no one could say where the fruit had come from, only that for one brief morning, the servants' hall smelled of citrus instead of damp wool. On Monday, Lenora sent for her before breakfast. The morning room fire had been built high again. though the day had warmed, and Mrs. Carson sat with a sheaf of correspondence arranged in descending size, each envelope slit with military neatness. "You have made unauthorized adjustments to breakage entries," Lenora said without preamble, tapping the ledger line Jade had signed for the split grain sack. "This is not your discretion." "The grain would have been charged to wages," Jade replied. "I carried it against my line, as recorded." Lenora lifted one shoulder, bored rather than angry. "You are sentimental with other people's labor and reckless with your own. It is an unattractive combination." Jade stood with her hands clasped behind her back, feeling the tiny ridge where a needle had pricked her thumb the previous night. The totals remain balanced. Balance is not your function. Lenora set down her pen. Obedience is. Jade inclined her head and said nothing. Silence had become both shield and protest, and Lenora, finding no purchase, dismissed her with a flick of fingers already reaching for the next letter. By midweek, market prices on flour had risen again, and the kitchen coal allotment had fallen by half a scuttle per day. Jade rewrote 3 meal plans by candlelight, then walked to St. James's, before dawn on Thursday to ask whether the parish widow fund still accepted old linen in exchange for lamp oil. The answer was yes, but in smaller measure than before. She returned with 1 bottle, 2 stale rolls, and mud on her hem. At the church steps, as she shifted the basket to free her key, someone said, "Your left strap is tearing." Mr. Reed stood 1 step below her, hat brim shadowing his eyes, coat plain as ever. He held a length of thin cord and a small awl, as if he had been repairing harness rather than crossing the square at first light. Jade looked down. The leather had indeed split near the buckle. "It carried yesterday. It will not carry tomorrow." He held out his hand for the basket. "May I?" She hesitated, then passed it over. He worked quickly, punching a clean new hole, threading the cord through with practiced economy, and knotting it in a way she recognized from stable tack, not grocery twine. His hands moved like a man accustomed to both tools and consequences. "You inspect baskets now, Mr. Reed?" she asked. "I inspect failure points." The answer was dry enough that she almost missed the edge of humor in it. Almost. When he handed the basket back, his gaze flicked once to her sleeve, where ink stained the cuff, despite scrubbing. "You were writing late. I was correcting figures that should not have required correction." He gave one short nod, as if the statement answered more than it said. "Then keep this." He placed the awl in the side pocket of her basket. "You will use it again." "I cannot take your tools." "You can return it on Saturday." He said it as logistics, not favour. She accepted because refusing would have been theatrical, and neither of them had patience for theatre at that hour. As she turned toward the Mews, he added, "Miss Carson." She paused. He looked at the repaired strap rather than at her face. "It was wise to charge the grain to your own line. The under-housekeeper has repeated your entry exactly. No wages were docked." It was a small fact in a narrow world. It warmed her more than the bottle of parish oil in her basket. She answered with formal composure she did not fully feel. "Thank you for the information. Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Reed." Neither acknowledged what had passed between them. Not courtesy, not intimacy, but recognition, precise enough to steady a day already tilted against her. Saturday arrived with thin sun and a bitter wind that found every crack in the pantry window frame. The delivery cart came later than usual. Jade was in the back garden cutting bolted lettuces for soup when wheels scraped at the service gate and the under-housekeeper called her name. Mr. Reed unloaded flour, onions, and 2 crates of apples. At the bottom of the cart, tucked behind root vegetables, sat another crate of oranges. Jade set down her knife. "You have made an expensive error." "I have made no error," he said. "We did not order citrus." "You were overcharged again in September. Different supplier. Same method." The under-housekeeper, hearing that practical language once more, muttered about dishonest men in trade and carried the apples inside. Jade waited until they were alone in the yard. "How do you know what we pay other suppliers?" she asked quietly. He tightened a rope and did not answer at once. "London is not as large as it appears from a front drawing room." "I no longer have a front drawing room." His eyes lifted to hers then, grey and direct. "I am aware." The words were simple. The impact was not pity, not admiration, awareness as fact. A kitchen maid emerged with a tally slate, and the moment closed. "Mr." Reed took the slate, corrected one line with a blunt carpenter's pencil before Jade could speak, and handed it back. "The ham weight is wrong," he said. "Your clerk copied 12 stone from last week. This is 10 1/4. Jade checked the tag and found he was right. "You catch everything." "No," he said. "Only what others miss on purpose." That afternoon she discovered a second corrected invoice on the pantry shelf, folded beneath the twine bundle where only she would look. He had initialed the margin with a single R and listed the true wholesale rate beside the inflated charge. Not accusation, evidence. 3 days passed before she saw him again, and those days were measured not by longing, but by workload and cold. Lenora announced a formal supper for interested parties at month's end, requested polished silver from storage, and instructed Jade to prepare guest tallies she was not invited to witness. The house began rehearsing a performance of prosperity it could no longer afford. On Wednesday, Jade carried lamp chimneys to the lower pantry and found Mr. Reed at the service door with 2 replacement crates and no cart in sight. He had delivered early, he said. The lane was blocked by roadworks. His coat was spattered at the hem, but his collar linen remained clean, and his speech stayed measured even as he shifted 60-pound sacks as if they were parcels of cloth. From the main corridor came a sharp male laugh. Mr. Bellamy had arrived to call on Lenora without notice, and his voice carried through the half-open baize door. "She is practical enough, I am told," he said to someone inside. "Beauty fades, utility remains." Jade froze with one lamp chimney in her hand, glass cold against her palm. She had not been meant to hear it. The remark was not shouted, merely placed where women in her position were expected to absorb and endure. Mr. Reed set down the sack he was carrying. He did not look toward the corridor. He looked at Jade. "Where would you like these, Miss Carson?" he asked, in a tone clear enough to carry past the bays and into the hall beyond. She understood the gesture at once. Give her public authority in the one arena still hers. She straightened and answered at normal volume. "Pantry, first shelf left, potatoes to the lower room, sugar-locked." "As you direct." He moved exactly as instructed. A moment later, Bellamy's laugh ceased. A door closed upstairs. The household resumed its choreography. Jade placed the lamp chimney on the table before speaking. "You did not need to do that." "I did not do anything." "You made sure I was heard." He lifted the second crate. "You were already speaking." It was the nearest either had come to naming the pattern between them. He would not let her be diminished in front of him. She would not call it kindness where others might call it interference. The boundary held, and yet each encounter moved it by a fraction. By the second week of October, the Saturday routine had hardened into ritual. Jade waited at the service step with slips in hand. Mr. Reed arrived with accurate weights and inconvenient truths. The under-housekeeper hovered. The kitchen watched from doorways and pretended not to watch. The polished black carriage still waited around the corner, always out of her direct sight. Yet once, while carrying turnips through the yard, She caught the flash of black lacquer through the mews arch and the square shoulder of a uniformed driver sitting too straight for an ordinary tradesman's route. She said nothing. Survival had taught her where not to place questions. That same morning, as she checked a sack seal, she noticed again the pale mark at the base of his right finger, the clean crescent where a signet ring had rested for years. No labourer wore such an absence. No labourer corrected legal phrasing on an invoice as he had done last week, changing liable to chargeable with instinctive precision. No labourer spoke to her with a formality that deepened rather than loosened when others were present. "Mr. Reed," she said. Pen paused over the page. "Where did you learn bookkeeping?" He tied off a flour sack and replied without flourish. "In a house where mistakes were expensive. That describes most houses." His mouth shifted, almost a smile. "Then we have that in common." The under-housekeeper returned, and he stepped back at once, expression neutral again. Distance reassembled itself around him like a coat. Later, in the pantry doorway, a junior maid arrived in tears over a broken soup tureen and a threatened wage deduction. Jade took the blame onto her own line before the girl could be dismissed. The maid fled in relief. Mr. Reed, who had been stacking onions, watched Jade enter the adjustment in the ledger with the same clean script she used for all losses she chose to absorb. "You cannot continue paying for every crack in this house," he said. "I can for now." For now is a narrow bridge. She sanded the ink and closed the book. Bridges are for crossing. For the first time in days, he smiled fully. It transformed him again from contained labourer to a man built for command and accustomed to withholding it. The expression was brief, then gone. "Then cross quickly, Miss Carson," he said. "Do not stop in the middle." He left by the service gate with empty crates, and she watched him until the mews wall cut off the line of sight. A minute later she heard, faintly, the crisp roll of carriage wheels taking weight, as if someone had just stepped inside. That evening, Lenora summoned her to review guest placements for the month-end supper. 2 columns of names covered the page. Mill owners, brokers, a solicitor, Mr. Bellamy. At the bottom, in Lenora's rigid hand, one line had been added and underlined twice. Transfer deed to be witnessed. Jade held the paper steady. Her pulse beat hard in the wrist beneath her cuff, but her voice remained level. "You are hosting a contract, not a supper." Lenora did not look up from sealing wax. "You are learning." Jade set the page back on the desk with perfect alignment and left before permission was granted. In the corridor, she paused only long enough to breathe once, deep and controlled, then descended to the steward's quarters and unlocked the small trunk at the foot of her bed. Inside lay 3 dresses, her father's brass compass, a packet of unpaid drafts copied in her own hand, and the empty velvet case that had once held her gold comb. She added the corrected invoices Mr. Reed had left her, tied with blue thread, and placed them beside the drafts. Physical proof. Numbers that did not flatter. Numbers that held. Upstairs, Carson House prepared its polished rooms and rehearsed gratitude. Downstairs, Jade sharpened her pencil, opened tomorrow's ledger, and wrote until the candle guttered, while somewhere beyond the mews arch, a carriage waited out of sight for a man who delivered groceries on Saturdays, and never once behaved as though that were all he did. Jade wrote until the candle flared, dipped, and sent a thin ribbon of smoke toward the low plaster ceiling, then capped the ink and flexed her cramped fingers over the open ledger. The house above had gone quiet in layers, first the front hall, then the family corridor, then the kitchen range reduced to embers. She was reaching for the brass compass to weigh a curling page when a dull scrape sounded in the yard, followed by the unmistakable knock of a body striking stone. She was on her feet at once. No shawl, no second thought. She crossed the passage, lifted the service latch, and stepped into the night air that smelled of wet brick and coal ash. Near the mews wall, half in shadow beneath the arch, a man in dark uniform lay folded against the stones, one arm braced as if he had tried to rise and failed. His cap had rolled 3 feet away. Even in the dimness she recognized him. The rigid posture on the carriage box, the polished boots, the profile she had only ever seen from a distance when the black carriage waited around the corner. "Sir," she said, kneeling beside him, "can you hear me?" His eyes opened with effort. They were bloodshot and unfocused, skin too hot when her fingers touched his temple. "Do not wake the house," he murmured through clenched teeth. "I will stand in a moment." "You will not." She slid his arm over her shoulder and tested his weight. "You have fever." He tried to pull back, discipline battling collapse. "I cannot be found here. You have already been found." She tightened her grip and rose in a single, controlled motion, taking his weight step by step toward the scullery door. "You may argue after you are breathing properly." The night kitchen was cold, but it was private. She settled him on the narrow bench near the wash copper, dragged a folded horse blanket from the laundry shelf, and covered him to the chest. His jaw trembled once with a chill he could not master. She poured water, lifted his head, and held the cup until he swallowed. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then gave it as if surrendering a guard post. "Peter Ellison." "I am Jade Carson. I keep the household accounts. You are safe here, Mr. Ellison." His laugh was a hoarse thread. "No one is safe in a great house, miss." The truth of it passed between them without ceremony. She moved to the doorway and called softly into the servants' passage until the night kitchen porter appeared, eyes wide, apron askew. She gave 3 instructions in rapid sequence. Bank the scullery fire higher, wake no one upstairs, and run to Hargreaves' apothecary with this exact message: high fever, shaking chills, urgent. The porter nodded and fled into the lane. When she turned back, Ellison was trying again to sit upright by force of will alone. She pressed him gently back to the bench. "Stillness is not defeat," she said. "It is in my post." "Not tonight." He stared at her as if measuring rank against refusal and finding the comparison irrelevant. Then he closed his eyes and let the blanket stay. Hargreaves arrived within the half hour, smelling of camphor and rain, leather case knocking against his knee. He listened to the chest, checked pulse, shook down a thermometer with professional impatience, and asked for payment before opening the fever powder. "Household account or private?" he said. "Private," Jade answered. He named a sum that reached past the coins in her work purse and into territory Lenora had forbidden this quarter. She did not bargain. She reached into her sleeve pocket, drew out the gold hair comb she had worn hidden in her braid since leaving the East Rooms, and placed it in his palm. Fine filigree, small seed pearls, her mother's initials cut beneath the hinge. The only ornament she had not surrendered. Hargreaves weighed it once, nodded, and pocketed it without comment. "This covers tonight and tomorrow's draft." "Put it in writing," she said. He blinked, then pulled a receipt slip from his case and wrote by the scullery lamp. She checked the amount, the date, and the listed medicines before folding the paper into her ledger satchel. Evidence first, grief later. By the time the first draft had been taken and the apothecary gone, the kitchen clock had struck 2. Jade sat on an upturned flower crate beside the bench, changing cool cloths at the back of Ellison's neck whenever his breathing roughened. He drifted in and out, muttering route times and street names, once apologizing to someone called my lord, with formal misery that made her look away out of respect for what fever strips from men. Near dawn, the The scullery door opened without warning. Mr. Reed stood on the threshold, coat damp at the hem, bareheaded, grey eyes sweeping the room in one silent assessment that took in blanket, medicine packet, water jug, and Jade's rolled sleeves. For a suspended beat she saw pure command in him, unvarnished and absolute. Then it was gone beneath his usual restraint. "He was not at his post," Reed said, voice low. "I searched the lane. He collapsed by the arch, fever." Jade rose, joints stiff from the crate. "Hargreaves has seen him. Powder every 4 hours, willow bark between doses. Water each half hour if he will take it." Reed's gaze shifted to Ellison's face, then back to hers, as if confirming every instruction had already been carried out. "You called the apothecary without waking Mrs. Carson?" "Yes." "You paid him?" "I did." He glanced once at the folded receipt visible in her satchel flap and understood more than she had spoken. His expression changed by a fraction, then steadied. "You should rest." "I will when his fever breaks." Reed stood very still, looking at her flour-dusted skirt, the damp cloth in her hand. The line of fatigue held rigidly out of her posture. When he smiled, it came brief and transformative, stripping away the labourer's plain reserve and revealing the formidable man she had sensed in fragments. Not merely capable, dangerous to underestimation. "Miss Carson," he said quietly, "there are debts that cannot be entered in ledgers." She wrung out the cloth over the basin and met his gaze. "Then they are not debts." For the first time, something close to warmth moved through his eyes without being hidden. He inclined his head, stepped to Ellison's side, and took the next watch without asking her to leave. She did not thank him. She simply sat again when her knees threatened to give and counted breaths until morning light found the edges of the scullery windows. 3 days passed before Ellison's fever broke fully. Jade measured those days in doses and laundry water, in stolen hours between pantry counts and still-room inventories. In the weight of sleep she did not permit herself. She told no one upstairs. The kitchen knew, of course. Kitchens always know. Yet even the under-housekeeper kept silent, perhaps because the man on the bench wore an unfamiliar uniform, perhaps because she had once buried a son and recognized stubborn care when she saw it. On the 4th morning, Ellison sat upright, pale but steady, and asked for his boots. Jade brought broth first. He took 3 spoonfuls, then set the bowl down with formal precision. "I owe you more than thanks, miss." "You owe me recovery," she said, "and compliance with Hargreaves for 2 more days." A shadow of humour crossed his face. "You give orders like dockside artillery." "I give practical ones." He reached into his coat and drew out a small leather purse. She stepped back before he could open it. "No," she said, "it is repayment." "It is not." "Miss Carson, you were ill. I paid what was required. That is finished." Ellison studied her, then returned the purse to his pocket with a nod that held both respect and resignation. "As you direct." When she turned toward the pantry corridor, she found Reed standing beyond the half-open door, not intruding, simply present. His eyes were unreadable in the dim passage. "He will return to light duty tomorrow," he said. "Not before evening," Jade replied. "His pulse still races on stairs." Reed accepted the correction without argument. "Evening, then." By the 2nd week of October's end, Ellison had resumed his carriage box, thinner but upright, and the black lacquered coach again waited where the mews curved out of direct view. Nothing in Carson House acknowledged the interruption. Lenora's household ran on polished surfaces and a mission, and anything that did not serve her design was treated as if it had never occurred. The wound arrived at luncheon in the form of paper. Lenora sent for Jade to the breakfast parlour, though no breakfast remained. Silver covers reflected window light like cold mirrors. Mr. Hale stood by the mantel with his folio. Mr. Bellamy lounged near the fire, broad face complacent, gloved fingers drumming the back of a chair as if timing a purchase. Two neighbouring matrons had been invited to witness what Lenora called family planning, and they watched Jade enter with the avid neutrality of women relieved not to be the day's subject. Lenora did not offer her a seat. "You will review the engagement supper list," she said, sliding a card across the table. 32 guests. The transfer deed will be signed before the first course, while all interested parties are present. Jade read the list once. Her name appeared beside no place setting. At the bottom, in Lenora's narrow script, Miss Carson, to stand as dependent ward until contract executed. A faint ringing began in Jade's ears, so sharp it almost blurred the room. She placed 2 fingers on the table edge until the grains steadied beneath her skin. "This language is inaccurate," she said. Lenora folded her hands. "It is useful." Mr. Bellamy gave a small, indulgent smile toward the matrons. "Practical arrangements require practical titles." Jade turned her eyes to him, then to Lenora. "I am not your ward." Lenora's tone remained flat, almost bored. "You are what the room accepts." The nearest matron lowered her gaze to hide interest. Mr. Hale cleared his throat but did not intervene. The social arithmetic was complete. 1 woman relabeled in public, 4 witnesses to make it feel legitimate. Jade set the card back on the polished wood with exact alignment. Her right hand trembled once. She tucked it behind her back. "If there is no question regarding pantry totals," she said, "I must return to inventory." Bellamy laughed softly. "There is discipline in her, Lenora. That can be trained." Lenora did not look away from Jade when she answered him. "Gratitude is trained." The words were not addressed to Jade. That was precisely why they landed with such force. Heat rose to her face, then drained just as quickly, leaving her cold from throat to fingertips. She inclined her head to the room at large, a courtesy no one had earned, and walked out at measured pace until the baize door closed behind her. In the corridor, she stopped beside the long case clock and pressed her palm against the carved wood until the shaking passed. She did not cry. She counted 12 ticks, inhaled once, and continued to the pantry where onions still needed sorting, and flour still had to be logged to the quarter pound. Work steadied her for an hour. Numbers held when people did not. She entered shipments, corrected a copied error in lamp oil, and locked the sugar cupboard. Then the yard bell rang for Saturday delivery. She wiped her hands and went to the service step, expecting Reed's quiet efficiency, the corrected weights, the unspoken vigilance that had become part of the week's structure. Instead, a different carter waited with a borrowed horse and an invoice already smudged at the corner. "Delivery for Carson House," the man said. "Temporary route." "Where is Mr. Reed?" Jade asked before she could stop herself. The carter shrugged. "No instruction given." She took the invoice. 2 weights were wrong. The ham was overcharged. The citrus line had vanished entirely. She corrected the figures in silence while the under-housekeeper watched with narrowed eyes. By evening, the black carriage had not appeared at the Mew's turn. By Monday, no message had come. The service gate felt larger in his absence, less like a threshold and more like an exposed edge. Jade folded the faulty invoice and placed it with the other corrected papers in her trunk, beside the unpaid drafts and Hargreaves' receipt for medicine. Each sheet another proof that what was done in quiet corners still counted. On Tuesday, Lenora announced the engagement supper date in the servants' hall, so no one could claim confusion. "Month's end," she said, gaze fixed on Jade. "Miss Carson will present herself in suitable dress and compliant temper." Jade met her eyes across the long table. Pulse steady now, voice clear. The pantry will be provisioned. Lenora's mouth curved without warmth. That is all you are required to provide. Jade dipped her head once and returned to the ledger, though every line swam for a moment before settling. Outside, wheels passed on the west road, then faded. Saturday had become a silence she could not budget for, and the house, sensing strain, tightened around her like a closed fist. The house tightened around her like a closed fist, and Jade refused to let it close. She finished the lamp oil column, blotted the ink, and carried the ledger toward the study because numbers still had to be signed, even when dignity was being priced for supper. The corridor outside Lenora's rooms was bright with afternoon polish, beeswax and coal heat, while voices moved behind the half-closed study door in the low, businesslike cadence of people arranging another person's life. Jade stopped when she heard Mr. Hale's careful baritone. If Miss Carson delays at table, witnesses may interpret uncertainty. Lenora answered without irritation, as if discussing seating cards. She will sign first, then marry where instructed. Gratitude is trained. The ledger edge bit into Jade's palm. Mr. Bellamy gave a brief laugh, pleased and shallow. Then we are agreed. Jade stood motionless until her pulse steadied enough to trust her hands. She could have stepped inside and asked to be treated as human in a room that had already removed her from the category. She did not waste the breath. She set the ledger on the hall table, turned and walked back to the service stairs at an even pace while the study voices resumed, satisfied that she had not heard. By Thursday evening, Carson House began to dress itself for the engagement supper. Silver warmed under polishing cloths. The front hall flowers were changed twice to conceal wilting stems. In the steward's quarters, Jade folded her plainest dark dress over a chair and opened her trunk. She laid out what mattered. The packet of unpaid drafts copied in her own hand. Reed's corrected invoices tied with blue thread. Hargreaves's receipt for Ellison's medicine, and the small brass compass that had belonged to her father. She did not yet pack the bag. She only arranged the evidence once, then locked the trunk and went upstairs to check the fish tally. At dusk, Lenora sent a maid with instructions for Jade to present herself in the breakfast parlour at 7 sharp, in suitable condition, for deed execution before guests were seated. The maid delivered the sentence with eyes fixed on Jade's shoulder. Jade thanked her, signed the kitchen coal receipt, and continued trimming turnips for soup, as if the order concerned someone else. At 6:30 she carried a tray of account slips to the front corridor and paused at the service turn where the stone floor met the polished entry tiles. Through the open fanlight she could see the curb lanterns and the Mews bend beyond. A polished black carriage stood exactly where it had stood every Saturday, lacquer catching the last thin light. Peter Ellison was on the box in full uniform, posture restored to rigid health. The side door opened. Mr. Reed emerged from the shadow of the vestibule in a plain, dark coat, hat low. Movement, controlled and familiar. He crossed toward the carriage with the same economy he used in the pantry. For one heartbeat she thought he would continue past it and vanish into the lane. Ellison climbed down, opened the carriage door, and said in a clear voice meant for no one inside the house, "My lord." Reed paused, one hand on the doorframe. He did not turn. The title landed cleanly, explaining the carriage, the driver, the authority in his quiet corrections, the ring mark, the watchful restraint. He stepped inside. Ellison shut the door, mounted the box, and the carriage rolled away before Jade could force air back into her chest. She set the tray down on the hall table because her fingers were no longer reliable. Her right hand shook so hard she pressed it against the carved banister until sensation returned. Not betrayed, she told herself with brutal precision. Not betrayed. simply uninformed in a world that fed on unequal information. A footman passed behind her with decanters and did not notice she had gone pale. Music from the drawing room drifted down in tentative scales while guests arrived. Jade inhaled once, deeply enough to hurt, then took the service stair to her room. She packed one bag, 2 dresses, the ledger satchel with every paper that had ever told the truth when people did not, her father's compass wrapped in a handkerchief, a spare pair of stockings, no ornaments, no plea note, no request for permission. She changed into the dark dress, pinned her cuffs, lifted the bag, and locked the steward's room behind her, leaving the trunk and bed and 6 weeks of managed humiliation where they stood. At 7, as instructed, she entered the study unannounced. Lenora stood beside the writing table in dark green silk, Mr. Hale at her right, with folio open, Mr. Bellamy near the fire, and 2 witnesses perched upright on gilt chairs, with the attentive stillness of people who enjoy procedural cruelty. A silver inkstand had been set in the centre of the desk. The transfer deed lay ready with ribbon markers. Every face turned toward Jade and then, almost at once, toward the bag in her hand. Lenora spoke first. "Miss Carson, you are late." Jade set the bag by the door. "I was finishing household records." Mr. Hale lifted the first page. "If you will sign at the marked lines, we may proceed to supper without inconvenience." He held out the pen. Jade stepped forward, read the opening clause, then the second, then the paragraph converting her future claims to marital trusteeship under Bellamy's household authority. Legal theft in smooth language. She set the pen back on the silver tray without touching ink. Lenora's expression did not alter. "Do not perform, Jade." Jade looked directly at the signature line, then at Lenora. Her voice was steady and low enough that everyone in the room leaned to hear it. "I will not sign." 4 words, no speech, no tremor. Bellamy made an impatient sound. "You are being foolish. Security is being offered." Jade turned to him once. "Not mine." Lenora's boredom sharpened. "If you leave this house now, you leave without support, reference, or protection." Jade inclined her head. "As noted." She picked up her bag. Mr. Hale half raised a hand, perhaps to salvage decorum, then let it fall when he saw she had already chosen consequence. The witnesses stared as if witnessing an error in etiquette rather than an act of refusal. Lenora did not call after her. Control withheld was still control, and she intended to frame this departure as ingratitude by dawn. Jade walked out, crossed the corridor lined with family portraits, and did not look up at any painted Carson face. She descended the back stair past the kitchen where no one spoke, and went through the service door into cold evening air with shelter behind her and uncertainty ahead. The cost was immediate. So was the freedom. She did not go to Street, James's Steps, where pity might find her first. She went to the parish registry offices near Holborn, because records opened early for shipping declarations, and because paper, unlike people, sometimes held. The night clerk at the adjoining lodging house gave her a narrow room in exchange for coin from her emergency purse and one reference name from years ago. She slept in her dress on top of the coverlet, bag against her ribs, and woke before dawn to bells and carriage rattle. At first light she crossed to the registry building, breath visible in the corridor chill, and asked for a certified extract of any codicil attached to Harold Carson's trust instruments. The senior clerk, thin and suspicious, requested proof of identity. Jade handed him 3 things in sequence: her father's compass with initials engraved, her own signature from the household account register, and Mr. Hale's preliminary settlement copy showing her legal name and relation. He examined each, nodded once, and disappeared into the records room with the packet. She sat in the antechamber on a hard bench beneath a window filmed with city soot. Her hands were quiet now. Fatigue had burned the shaking out of them. She watched dust move in a bar of pale light and listened to quills scratching behind closed doors. Footsteps sounded in the corridor, measured, unhurried, unmistakably familiar. She looked up. Mr. Reed stood in the doorway without cap or workman's coat. He wore a formal dark coat cut to rank, plain linen, gloves in one hand. Nothing ornate, nothing performative, yet every line of him belonged to rooms where instructions were not repeated. Ellison waited 2 paces behind, restored and impassive. Reed met her gaze and spoke with the same calm he had used over flour weights and broken straps. "My name is Lord Thomas Reed Ashford. I am principal investor in Carson Shipping and co-trustee of your father's sealed codicil." The antechamber seemed to go very still. Jade did not rise. She did not offer him outrage, because outrage required surprise, and she had already spent that at the curb. Thomas continued, voice low, almost gentle in its precision. "I delivered your groceries to learn whether dignity still lived in Carson House before placing an empire in your hands." She held his gaze, hearing in that single sentence every corrected invoice, every observed slight, every Saturday that had been inspection disguised as routine. Not a game. A test with consequences large enough to terrify her if she let herself look away. The records clerk returned at that moment with a tied packet and a registry seal. He bowed to Ashford first from habit, then to Jade from instruction he did not yet understand. "Certified extract, my lord, for Miss Carson's review." Thomas stepped aside and did not touch the packet. "To Miss Carson," he said. The clerk corrected himself instantly and placed the papers in Jade's hands. She broke the seal. The codicil was brief, legally brutal, and clear. Upon verified independent residence of Harold Carson's natural daughter, controlling shares held in temporary widow stewardship reverted to Miss Jade Carson. Any coerced transfer executed under household dependency was void. Co-trustees Ashford and Heir were charged to enforce immediate restoration. Jade read the lines twice, then folded the pages along their existing creases. She felt no triumph yet, only a deep, clean shift inside her, like a lock turning after months of pressure against the wrong key. "You knew," she said, not accusing, not absolving, "all this time." "I knew the terms," Thomas answered. "I did not know you." Ellison kept his eyes on the corridor wall, giving them privacy inside protocol. Outside, carts began to crowd the morning street, London already bargaining, buying, surviving. Jade stood, packet in one hand, bag in the other. What happens now? Thomas's expression remained composed, but something warmer moved beneath it. Now, we return to Carson House with the registry seal and Mr. Hale present. Mrs. Carson's authority ends on paper before noon. He paused, then added in the same measured voice he had used the first day in her pantry, only this time without disguise. "You will decide the rest." Jade nodded once. "Then let us proceed." "Then let us proceed." The black carriage took them through streets Jade had crossed on foot for months, but from the interior she saw how sharply London separated those who waited from those expected. The cushions smelled faintly of cedar and winter wool. Opposite her, Lord Ashford sat with gloved hands resting on his cane, not speaking unless speech was needed, giving her the same disciplined quiet he had given her in the pantry, when numbers mattered more than comfort. Peter Ellison rode outside. She heard his measured calls at each turn and remembered him burning with fever on the scullery bench, muttering apologies to a title she now knew. At Carson House, the front steps had been washed for the previous evening's guests. petals still bruised along the curb. A footman opened the carriage door, glanced up, and froze when he recognized her emerging first. Travel bag in one hand and sealed packet in the other. He recovered quickly, bowed too low, and said, "Miss Carson," in the old tone, the one from before her demotion, before he could stop himself. She did not pause for that small correction of the world. She crossed the hall and entered the morning room where Lenora took late tea when she intended to receive visitors from a position of leisure. Lenora looked up from correspondence, saw Jade, then saw Ashford, and in the space of one breath rearranged her face from annoyance to social composure. "Lord Ashford," she said, rising. "This is unexpected." "Not unexpected, Mrs. Carson," he replied. "Scheduled. Mr. Heir is on his way." Lenora's gaze moved to the packet in Jade's hand. "If this concerns last evening's unpleasant display, Miss Carson has removed herself and made my obligations simpler." Jade placed the registry extract on the table between the teacups. "Read the seal." Lenora did not touch it. "I have no need to read documents delivered like threats." Ashford's voice remained level. "You have legal need." 3 minutes later, Mr. Heir was shown in. Hair wind-shifted, folio clutched too tightly, clearly summoned in haste from chambers. He bowed to Lenora, to Ashford, then to Jade, and his eyes held a brief, unmistakable apology for all the moments in which he had chosen procedure over her person. He broke the registry ribbon with a thumb that trembled once, read in silence, then read aloud, because there could be no ambiguity left to hide within. By codicil to the trust instruments of Harold Carson, dated and sealed, controlling shares held in temporary widow stewardship revert to Miss Jade Carson upon verified independent residence. Any transfers executed or attempted under dependent household status is void. Co-trustees Lord Thomas Reed Ashford and Edward Heir are instructed to enforce immediate restoration. Lenora laughed softly, brittle as glass under heat. "Independent residence, she slept in my steward's quarters, within my walls." Jade opened her bag and drew out the evidence she had carried through the night. The copy of her registration in household books as domestic daughter with separate allotment, receipts for provisions paid from her personal purse, Hargreaves's slip for private medical payment, corrected invoices tied with blue thread, copied drafts of debts she had managed without title. She laid each sheet in a neat row. Her hand was steady. "I lived under your roof," she said, "not under your authority." Mr. Heir examined each paper, lips moving with the arithmetic of dates. When he reached Hargreaves's receipt, he looked up. "This payment was made from personal effects?" "Yes." "For a servant not employed by this household?" "For a man who would have died without treatment." Ashford said nothing. He did not need to. By 11:30, the legal room had shifted from drawing-room performance to administrative surrender. Heir drafted the enforcement minute at Lenora's own desk, sanded it, and read it into the record while 2 clerks from chambers witnessed signatures. Lenora signed where required because refusal would have triggered public injunction before supper hour, and she understood reputational costs better than anyone. Her hand did not shake. Her mouth thinned each time Heir turned a page. "Mrs. Carson retains widow's allowance at fixed quarterly amount," Heir read. "No discretionary control over shipping accounts, household contracts tied to company revenue, or marital directives concerning Miss Carson." Lenora set down the pen. "You stage this as justice. It is merely transfer." Jade met her gaze and answered in 4 quiet words. "Transfer is enough." The under-housekeeper was called in to receive revised household authority lines. She entered expecting reprimand, saw Jade at the head of the table beside open ledgers, and stopped short. The woman's eyes flicked to Lenora, then back to Jade, and for the first time in months she addressed her without hedging. "How shall stores be signed, miss?" "By actual weight," Jade said, "and no wage deductions for breakage caused by short staffing. Record damage where it belongs." The under-housekeeper nodded once, relief and caution braided together. "Yes, Miss Carson." What she had known she did not dramatize. At the door she paused and added, almost under her breath, "The boy with the grain sack kept his wages. He never forgot." Then she left before the sentence could become sentiment. Jade asked for one more person. Hargreaves the apothecary arrived after noon, hat in hand, suspicious of summons, until Hale requested his ledger entry for the night of Ellison's collapse. Hargreaves produced the notation and confirmed payment by gold comb, accepted in lieu of coin. Hale entered the amount as reimbursable personal expenditure under emergency household preservation, but Jade shook her head. "Do not reimburse from house funds," she said. "Record it as closed." Ashford glanced at her, understanding the boundary. Some costs were not to be undone because undoing would pretend they had not mattered. By 1 o'clock, the transfer deed prepared for Bellamy's supper sat unsigned and legally useless in Hale's folio. Bellamy himself sent a messenger demanding clarification. Hale wrote the reply in 10 lines and sealed it before handing it to the boy. Proposed arrangement void. No claims recognized. No further attendance required. External contact answered neatly and final. Lenora rose to leave the room she no longer controlled. At the threshold she turned once, rings catching the light. "You think dignity feeds households. It does not." Jade stood behind the ledger table, ink already on her fingers from opening a new account book under her own name. "Neither does contempt." Lenora left without another word. She was not redeemed. She was reduced to the limit the codicil allowed. That afternoon, Jade walked through the warehouse yard on Carson Wharf, where clerks had previously turned her away with embarrassed courtesy and invented instructions from upstairs. The river smell met her before the doors did. Rope tar, wet timber, spice dust from split crates, iron and tide. Men looked up as she entered the office, then looked again when Ashford followed 2 paces behind and remained by the door rather than taking the central chair. Mr. Price, senior warehouse clerk, removed his spectacles so abruptly he nearly dropped them. "Miss Carson, we were informed—" "You were informed incorrectly," she said. She placed Hale's enforcement minute on the desk. "Open the October books." Price read the first line, swallowed, and signalled for the junior clerk to bring ledgers from the locked cabinet Jade had never been permitted to approach. The cabinet key scraped, turned, and yielded. She took the top volume herself, opened it, and found the familiar architecture of numbers waiting for honest hands. Freight losses overstated on 2 routes. Insurance entries rounded in someone else's favour. Supplier variance concealed across 3 columns. Nothing theatrical. Just the steady bleed she had sensed from the household side. "Mr. Price," she said, "begin with dockage reconciliation for August and September. We correct old fiction first." "Yes, Miss Carson." By the time the warehouse clock struck 4, she had submitted every physical paper she had carried and assigned each to its place. Copied drafts to audit file, corrected invoices to supplier dispute ledger, medicine receipt noted and closed, registry extract locked in trust drawer, temporary domestic registration archived as proof of residence. Even the small awl Reed had given her rested on the desk corner until she picked it up and crossed to him. "You asked for this back on Saturday," she said, offering it handle first. His mouth shifted with that restrained, near smile. "I said you would use it again." She considered, then slipped it into the top drawer beside sealing wax and fresh nibs. Kept, not returned. Tool, not token. Dusk laid a copper band across the office windows. One by one the clerks withdrew, boots fading down the corridor, until only river sounds remained and the scratch of Jade's pen as she entered the final correction of the day. Her cuffs were rolled. A dark smudge marked her thumb. The brass compass lay open near the ledger, needle steadying north with quiet insistence. Ashford had not moved far from the door. He had answered 2 questions from staff in clipped, definitive phrases, then yielded the room back to her. Now, when she capped the ink and flexed her hand, he spoke without title and without command. "May I call on Sunday?" he asked, "instead of Saturday?" She looked up at him, at the man who had arrived in workman's gloves to test a house, and ended by standing in her office as if his authority meant most when set down, not displayed. The crux between them was no longer concealment, it was choice, given plainly. "Yes," she said, "on Sunday." He inclined his head, and in the soft warehouse light the gesture felt less like permission granted, and more like an agreement entered by equals. He opened the door for her as they left together, not in secrecy and not in spectacle, while behind them the corrected ledgers dried on the desk where she had once been barred from standing, and the house that had called her useful only when silent now answered to her name.